Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan to all the attendees. Alhamdulillah, Darul Qasim is pleased to welcome our guest, Dr. Fareeha Khan, and have her present this seminar today. So just a little bit about the seminar. So the modern age presented particular challenges for Muslims in colonial India. They found themselves doubly minoritized, both globally as Islamic influence weakened and locally under British colonization, alongside the rise of Indian majoritarian nationalism. This seminar aims to explore three patterns of Islamic reform that emerged among Muslims during this era. We will investigate how these patterns can serve as prototypes for teaching and preserving Islam in an era where Muslims no longer hold political dominance. This workshop is based on Dr. Fareeha Khan's forthcoming article in the Oxford Handbook on Islamic Reform, forthcoming, titled The Development of Muslim Reform Movements as a Response to Minoritization. And just a little bit about Dr. Fareeha Khan. So she is a scholar of intellectual history with a special interest in modern-day Islamic learning networks and articulations of Muslim social practice. She has served as advisory editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Law and is the author of the forthcoming book titled The Quest for Everlasting Kingdom, the Sufi Jurist's Response to the Minoritization of India's Muslims. Dr. Fareeha also serves Muslim communities in the US and UK as a public intellectual through her writing and teaching at the Sila Initiative. So Jazakumullah khairan again for everyone who's attending. Jazakallah khairan to Dr. Fareeha Khan. Now I will go ahead and let Dr. Fareeha Khan go ahead. Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to have this opportunity to share some of my work with you guys in this audience. Maybe some of you know of my work through the Sila Initiative, but I don't normally get an opportunity to present my academic work to a Muslim audience, and I'm grateful to Darul Qasim for allowing me to do that. So Jazakumullahu khair. As Alat mentioned, my name is Fareeha Khan, and the title of our talk today is, or the workshop is, Paradigms of Islamic Reform in an Age of Minoritization, Deobandis, Barelwis, and the Modernists of Colonial India. And as was mentioned, the material that I'm covering today is basically just a very summarized version of what I have done in this article called The Development of Muslim Reform Movements as a Response to Muslim Minoritization. It's going to be coming out in a volume called The Oxford Handbook on Islamic Reform, edited by Imad Hamde and Natana Delangbas. So if, it's actually a very long and fun article. I had a really good time writing that piece. It's quite detailed, and I cover a number of things in there. It was actually really difficult for me to figure out how to summarize it for a short session like this. So I'd highly recommend, if you're interested in the topic or you find something to be intriguing in our presentation today, of course, bring up your questions at the end of the session. But, for more detail, go to the article, inshallah, once it's out. And just a little bit more about myself, so you kind of understand where I'm coming from. I think some of the people in the audience here, I can sort of guess that they're coming from a South Asian background. Like myself, I'm originally from Chicago, where Darul Qasim is located, the suburbs of, I'm not from the suburbs, I'm actually from the city originally. And, growing up as a Muslim within what you would call the South Asian diaspora, like Desis in the West, I guess you could say, I had a lot of questions about how the South Asians ended up in places like Australia, the UK, US, right? We're all over the world now. How did that happen? And as Muslims, the kinds of efforts that had been put in to preserve and maintain the deen by the ulama of the home country, you could say, from the ulama of what was at that time India, which is now broken up into multiple states like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I had these questions, and I had this sort of curiosity, probably just because of my own personal background, but also because of the kinds of scholarly exposure I had from a very young age. Growing up in the city of Chicago, the ulama who would lead our Taraweeh prayers, who would teach us Quran, they were all basically from a Deobandi background. Most of the people that I was exposed to, at least growing up, were from a Deobandi background. And so, but my interest as an academic is in Islamic reform and how Muslims in the contemporary age deal with practicing the deen, how do they maintain the deen. And I find that the changes that happened in sort of like the late 1800s, early 1900s within India to be they really speak to us and our condition. They kind of help give us clarity and put light on the situation that we are in today as minority Muslims in the West. So that's a little bit about why I'm interested in this from a personal perspective. And hopefully you will have be able to connect with the material in the same way, or maybe in different ways. Now, for today's talk, I've outlined it as follows. We're going to be covering, inshallah, Muslim dominance in India quickly in the beginning of our presentation today. We'll go into a little bit about the idea of minoritization and why I'm calling this process minoritization. I'm going to talk a little bit then about the pain of loss, meaning the loss of Muslim sovereignty over Muslim India. And then we'll go into Shah Waliullah's call to action and the three reformist responses that came in response to that call to action, okay, which was basically the three groups that we outlined in the title of the talk, the Modernists, the Deobandis, and the Barelwis. And so what we have first is just to reacquaint you, you might be familiar with this already, but perhaps not. The Muslims ruled India, right? They ruled in India for a millennium, you could say. They didn't rule it necessarily in the way that we might imagine today. It was, from the 12th century onwards, there were various empires ruling over India that were Muslim, and the ones that are maybe the most well-known are the Delhi Sultanate and, of course, the Mughal Empire. There were also smaller Muslim kingdoms spread throughout the land, the Bahmani, the Carnatic, the Deccan Sultanates, right? These were groups that ruled over the Indian subcontinent. And essentially, this was what you could say Muslims being in power, right? Muslims ruling over a vast expanse of what is today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, what was at that time, you could say, called India, but it didn't have the national kind of identity that it does today. So we have here a map of the Mughal Empire at its peak in terms of its spread over the landmass, where this is under the Emperor Aurangzeb, who died in 1707. So this was like the largest sort of expanse of Muslim control over India, and you can see it's huge. You can see here in the north you have Lahore and Peshawar, parts of Pakistan today, Multan. You have also then right the top in the middle you have Delhi, which was the center of the Mughal Empire, and a number of other cities are listed here on this map. Delhi was the center of the rule of Muslim rule for this a good chunk of this Muslim rule period. Even if there were other Muslim kingdoms or sultanates in power in other parts of India, oftentimes they would pay allegiance in some way to the Mughal emperor. And so it was really the center of political and cultural power. Now, we see that because of that power and because of that rule, the Muslims were a minority, just as they are today. Numerically, the Muslims were a minority. But because they were in political power, they wouldn't really be called a minority, right? They weren't a political minority. They had a sense of ownership over the land. They felt a sense of confidence in their deen, in their identity as Muslims. They had, any potential sense of weakness that they might feel because of numerical minority was mitigated by things like the economic strength. The Mughal Empire at its peak, and the Muslims in India in general were very wealthy. Some of the wealthiest empires in the world at the time. And they also belonged to the larger, broader Islamicate civilization, which ruled good parts of what was the world at the time, where cultural dominance was in the hands of the Muslims, in the way that you could say it is in the hands of Western powers today, right? Culturally, it was the Islamicate is like a phrase formed by Professor Marshall Hodgson in The Venture of Islam. Those of you who are academics will recognize that, indicating the kind of cultural power and dominance that resulted from the political spread of the Muslims in the during this period, like of the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, even into the Mughal period. Now, with this, there was a flourishing of not just the arts and language. Persian was the dominant language of Muslim India. It wasn't Arabic and it wasn't Urdu. Urdu didn't come onto the scene until late 1800s, right? So the administration was all handled in the Persian language, and the literature was in Persian. Whatever you find of adabi stuff, of literary stuff, you'll find in Persian up until through the 1800s, and we'll hear about this a little bit more as we continue today. With, as I mentioned, the local Urdu language only becoming used in academic or intellectual, writing very late in the picture, in the late 1800s. And you have, in the northern region surrounding Delhi, you have, this cultural flourishing, and you have the major figures of what you could call like the classical Indian Muslim period. The great Sufis, for example, like Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi or Ali al-Hujwiri Dataganj Baksh. This is a little bit north of Delhi, like 200 miles north of Delhi. You have Shah Waliullah, who we'll hear about a little bit later on today, the great figure from the 1700s. Also, he was directly from Delhi. And so this northern region was a really important place. And it also was the place where the British, when they did come as colonizers to India, that's where they set up their political center as well, in Delhi. And they, it wasn't like this, how they came to India was actually through trade. It wasn't through, outright political takeover. It was through trade, through the, you might have heard of entities like the East India Company, where, slowly, the resources, the natural resources, the textiles, and the various things that were in India that were needed to fund the growing industrialization back home in Europe and in England, the trade that happened with the British eventually led to a slow political takeover, not just economic relations. Initially, the Muslims, they accepted the British coming and the trade that was happening, but it turned into something else, as we're not going to get into today, because the colonial history is deep and is quite interesting on its own. Well, and a little bit of it is covered in the article, but not too much even there. Now, so what we have then is the British, as they begin to establish their roots and their power within India, you have then a number of changes that begin to happen on the ground. And we have things like, a number of different things that are happening in the Muslim world at this time. So we're talking, the colonization is happening in India. It's actually where India is like one of the earliest places where the British arrive and begin to colonize. But then we have the trade that is happening, and then what is essentially what begins to happen is the British have more and more power and more control over the Muslim polities. And as this begins to happen, the influence, of course, of the Mughal ruler and those who are tied to Mughal rulership, such as the ulama, who were funded by the royalty, by the king, by the emperor, they begin to lose their influence. And here I've written on this slide a couple of definitions for minoritization. Minoritization is a phenomenon that we hear about much more in applying to like the 1900s, not the early part of colonization. It applies to, so we have a couple of definitions here. We have to make a person or group subordinate in status to a more dominant group or its members. We also have another definition here where the system, we can think of minoritization as the systematic process by which elites deny power or access to a group through the implementation of power, be that local, linguistic, economic, or political. And it's a little bit unusual maybe for myself to talk about what's happening, because we're going to be getting into Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and Shah Waliullah first, and then Sir Syed Ahmad, and then the Deobandis and the Barelwis. There wasn't a sense of people being a political minority in the way that we think of minorities today yet. In the time of, for example, Shah Waliullah, and in the time of Sir Syed, even you could say only maybe towards the end of the life of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, you can sort of start seeing a sense of, we are a minority. But this was a gradual process. And the reason why I am linking all of these groups together under the umbrella of minoritization is that I do believe that that process of the Muslims beginning to start to see themselves as having lost something, as having an inability to really have control over their own lives, their practice of the religion, of the way in which they could live as Indian Muslims, the confidence that they had before begins to diminish. So it's like sort of like this pre-minoritization phase that I'm also talking about here in this talk, where, what we have, for example, is, we have, let's see, we have, the political representation of Muslims, for example, begins to be seen as something that is numerically determined. So you're going to show yourself as a Muslim by your communal affiliation, where previous to this, Muslims were not thought of as in numbers. They were thought of, as their in fact, they weren't even thought of as a unified group throughout all of India. So you have the Muslims in the Bengal, for example, and the Muslims of North India, centered around Delhi, not really seeing each other as politically tied in the same way that they begin to, as the British start asking the Muslims to represent themselves in a communal fashion, to talk about themselves in a, where they introduce the idea of the majority and the minority native populations. And this they did because of, so one of the major events that happened, actually, which you could say signaled the end of Muslim rule to to everybody was the Mutiny of 1857. And the Mutiny of 1857 was essentially the Muslims and the Hindus both standing up against what was becoming more and more British rule over India. They had a lot of grievances about how they were being treated, about the way their economic opportunities were being given to them, and a number of other grievances that they had. There was a sort of a standing up of the native Indian Muslim and Hindu population against the British. And the British very ruthlessly put that down. They put it down in a very bloody incident, which is called, the rebellion or the mutiny, depending on whose perspective you're looking at. And during that time, there was, the native population who had revolted was put down with a severe punishment. The Muslims in particular got a lot of blame for what happened with this mutiny, and the Mughal emperor at the time, who was basically just a kind of like a puppet figure, was officially removed and exiled from India. And along with the killing of the people who had actually been involved in the physical rebellion, there was also a great strong retaliation from the British against the ulama, who were seen to be kind of like the ones who were instigating the anger and the rebellion against the British. So, for example, in the neighborhood of Kucha Chelen, which is like a neighborhood in Delhi where the prominent Muslim ulama families used to live, it was something like 1,400 persons were shot by the British and killed in 1857 in retaliation for the mutiny. So when this occurred, after this, a number of different processes were put in place to begin to directly rule. Now we had the British Raj in place, not anymore the British East India Company. It's no longer this pretense of we're a business or an economic entity in your land. Now we are officially in power with the aftermath of the 1857 mutiny. And here is when the kinds of rhetoric that was used to make the Muslims really realize and be conscious of their numerical minority begins to happen, where the minoritization, in a sense of, the sense of being beleaguered and represented only according to how many people you can muster to support you on any particular platform, that begins to happen about this time. Now, this there's a lot that can really be said about how the Muslims responded to this situation. The mutiny was a really heartbreaking thing for the Muslims of India in particular, because they had lost not just not just the empire and the political power, but they had lost a sense of being really safe in India as people whose religion and whose culture could thrive without threat, right? And so here I have here on the slide a quote by Abul Kalam Azad, one of the great thinkers of the latter, of the early 1900s, middle 1900s, where he said, "I'm wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born." And he wasn't the only one. From very early on, you hear from the 1800s, people like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan calling the Muslims to stand and really be proud of their religion, that the blood of the people, the Muslims, has turned white, meaning you're cowardly and you're sort of succumbing to the British cultural changes that were happening. We have a little bit later than that, the great poem of Muhammad Iqbal, called the Shikwa, and then in response to that, the Jawab al-Shikwa, which was essentially a complaint. Initially, the Shikwa meaning complaint to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that why have you put us in this condition? Why have we lost the power that we had, the place that we had within India? And as the there's basically a lot of stress and a lot of sorrow, a lot of anxiety. There's this feeling, this potential that one could lose what one has. And now, with that, what I'm going to just go to quickly is a little bit about Islamic learning in Muslim India. So prior to, we could say, during the Muslim rule of India, there was Islamic learning was strong and it was widespread. There were many ulama, there were madaris, there were centers of learning. And the way in which the sciences of the religion were divided were basically they were basically put into two categories, the manqulat and the ma'qulat. With the manqulat being the transmitted sciences, those that were naqled, right? So like they were passed down, being sciences like of tafsir and hadith and fiqh. Then you have the ma'qulat, you could translate as the rational sciences, I guess, and those would be like logic and philosophy. Both of these, the ma'qulat and the manqulat, were strongly emphasized by the ulama of India. And then in terms of the madhab and the Sufi teachings, there was a very strong entrenchment, you could say, I guess. I mean, basically all of India was Hanafi. There were pockets of Shafis along the coastal regions, for example, but essentially it was a very Hanafi setup within the circles of Islamic learning. And then for the Tasawwuf had a tremendous influence. I mean, it was, you could say, the greatest way in which Muslims sort of thought about the religion. It was, the two things were tied. The Sharia and the Tariqah were not separate in the way that we might think of it today. So the big tariqas of that time were the Chishti and the Qadri and the Naqshbandi. These were widespread throughout the land. And we have, in the 1700s, we have Shah Waliullah as somebody who sort of presents a model of how to basically, he has this way of calling Muslims to really think about the tradition in a completely different way. So here we have a quote of Shah Waliullah's where he is talking about the need to translate the Quran into the Persian language. And up until this time, there were some translations of the Quran into Persian, but not in a way in which he is calling. So this is from his words. He says, "Due to the exigencies of the time in which we live and the kingdom in which we reside, it is necessary that a translation of the Quran be attempted in simple diction and idiomatic Persian, without clarifying its excellence or use of song-like prose or stories and moral directives, so that both the elite and the common can understand it together, and that everyone, old and young, may grasp its meanings. It is toward this important task that this humble slave has been called upon to accomplish." Shah Waliullah, he was someone who, he was from the Naqshbandi order. He was from Delhi. And as a young man, he trained in the various sciences under the guidance of his father, Shah Abdul Rahim. This was a family that was known for their learning in North India. But as a young man, he then traveled to Mecca and Medina. And when he was in the Hijaz in the early 1700s, he began to become exposed to ways of studying the hadith that had not been seen yet back home in India. And so when he came back, he had these ideas of looking to the hadith directly rather than blindly, quote unquote, following the madhab, the Hanafi school. He was not hesitant in looking, for example, to the Shafi'i madhab or the ahadith and picking rulings that he felt were more strongly corroborated by the ahadith. And there were many people who were uncomfortable with this, strongly uncomfortable with this in India, because the Hanafi school wasn't just seen to be as a madhab, it was seen to be something that was necessary in your practice of the religion. And so his call, Shah Waliullah's, to try and make the Quran even more accessible, not just accessing a hadith, but even the Quran, which was really something that was studied more by the elite, the scholarly elite, and not by the masses. This was something that was highly unusual. It was something that was unheard of. We hadn't had an idiomatic Persian translation of the Quran up until this time. But what is even more interesting about Shah Waliullah, which I think is actually one of his greatest contributions, is something called his theory of irtifaqat, which is basically, he has this idea that he lays out in his book called Hujjatullah al-Baligha. Some of you might be familiar with this work. It's a very famous work, where the irtifaqat are stages of human development. The Shah Waliullah isolates in his book Hujjatullah al-Baligha. And the point is that he talks about human beings and how human beings have developed from like a primitive socio-political hunter-gatherer type modes of social organization to higher and higher levels of development until they become sophisticated in their skills and in their methods of socio-political organization. And what's really unusual about Shah Waliullah is that he's talking about this in almost like a sociological way. He doesn't bring in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam within his discussion of this idea of social development at all. It's almost like he's talking as a sociologist, like it's very dispassionate and not directly tied. A lot of the sections where he's talking about the irtifaqat, you have very little reference to what is God's role. There is reference to God, but not what is God's role in the development of these human societies. And his way of talking about then the ultimate culmination of what happens for what he calls the universality of purpose, what distinguishes man from beast. For this to happen, you need to have a prophet. He brings this in at the sort of the highest level of human development, who is able to use divine inspiration, and by doing that, they are inspired to see things as they actually are, this is a common description of what a prophet is. But what's really important is that he ties this to action. That he says this necessary knowledge is attained often through the formation of an instinctive ability whereby his intuitional understanding invariably leads him to the right patterns of behavior. So the prophet is the person who, because of his inspiration, he's able to tell people what they should be doing, how should they be behaving, what action should they be taking. And essentially, this way of talking about effective action, socially effective action, is, I think, what is really unique and different about Shah Waliullah. It is his greatest contribution, because for you to be able to make socially effective action, if that thing is put into the hands of the regular person, what you're actually doing is you're saying that you should be someone who should do something to make sure people are acting correctly in society, right? And what is another way of saying that? This is a call to action toward reform, of calling people to not, it's no longer tied to a scholarly apparatus where there is a political dominance and a strong scholarly apparatus that is upheld by an emperor or the king or the Mughals. And because of the cultural dominance, political dominance, and the way that you talk about religion through the gateway of the ulama, you have religion spread from a sort of handed down way through the protection of what could be the methodologies or the systems that the ulama put in place. But with Shah Waliullah, defining a kind of mode of thinking about human beings and the role of religion within the human society, it becomes more in the hands of the regular person, that they can stand up and then they can do something, right? That they have actually the duty to do something, that they should be able to read the Quran in their own language so that they can understand what moral directives Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving them, that they should be able to go to the ahadith and know what it was that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told them to do. This sounds really normal and like regular for us in our day, but it was not at that, in his period in the 18th century. This was a very revolutionary call that he was making. And what we have with that call, so you have Shah Waliullah, he dies in 1762. Here you can see in the timeline. You have the mutiny happens after him. So Shah Waliullah is not alive when the British are really, he was alive when they just first maybe set foot, you could say, within the Indian subcontinent, but even their economic strength and control over the various lands was very minimal by the time he died. But in the time of the life of his son, Shah Abdulaziz, you start seeing Shah Abdulaziz and the legacy, the ulama who were of the legacy of Shah Waliullah's school, they were definitely uncomfortable with the presence of the British. And then in 1857, you have the mutiny, where the British establish outright political control. And with that, the legacy of Shah Waliullah, which was very powerfully communicated and accepted by North Indians in particular, all of these three groups that we're talking about today, the modernists, which who I'm referring to is those who took from the thought of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan and the college that he formed in Aligarh in North India, and the Barelwis and the Deobandis. They all were from this North Indian region, very enamored by the work of Shah Waliullah in their own way. Each of these three groups inherited from this socially effective call to action of Shah Waliullah. With Sir Syed, Sir Syed quotes him very much in his own work on tafsir in the Quran, as you'll hear in just a minute. Ahmad Raza Khan Barelwi takes from Shah Waliullah through his son Shah Abdulaziz, and then the Deobandis, which you could say with the Maulana Nanotwi and Gangohi and Tanwi, these were very much indebted to the writing and the work of the inheritors of Shah Waliullah through Sayyid Ahmad Shaheed and Shah Muhammad Ismail, right? So all three groups, the modernists, the Barelwis, and the Deobandis, end up taking from Shah Waliullah. Now, what I'm going to do quickly is highlight some of the ways in which they proposed reform. They basically took action to mitigate the problems that they were seeing as political power was lost in India. With the first one, the earliest one, being Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. And Sir Syed, he was a person from what you would call the ashraf, the nobility, the noble classes of the North Indians, being a descendant of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's a Sayyid, and he comes from an aristocratic kind of family. And he has in his work quite a bit of, you could say, he's trying to respond to the coming of the British by making Islam speak to modern British thought. And he has, for example, his way of responding is essentially how we must accept what is happening politically, and we must work within the framework that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed us in. And so he has, for example, a tafsir methodology that he creates in response to the stress of minoritization that he feels, where he says, he declares that there's nothing in the Quran that contradicts the laws of nature, including supernatural occurrences like miracles. Sir Sayyid was highly open to the idea of thinking about things even within the Quran and within the Islamic tradition that if they didn't mesh, or they didn't seem to match what scientific discoveries were telling him, and were telling, that were coming out of Europe and England, that it would be okay, it would actually be necessary to rethink those religious teachings in light of new scientific discoveries. So he, for example, he denies that there was anything called miracles, that these were simply things like miracles, or even the virgin birth of Isa alayhi salam. He tries to explain them actually in a different way. And the methodology that he uses, he says that just as the Muslims in the classical period, they were able to rethink Islamic teachings from within a Greek within Greek philosophy, like they could make it sort of match that and take from it and not be afraid. He felt that the same thing should be done with the Islamic sciences and interpretation of the Quran, which was, as you can imagine, very shocking to the Muslims of that period, in particular the ulama. There were figures both outside of India and within India who strongly condemned his comfortableness of accepting scientific rationale as a way to rethink Islamic teachings. They had a real problem with that. But what he also did was, in fact, establish a Muslim Oriental college, what he called the Muslim Anglo-American Oriental College at Aligarh, where he actually didn't emphasize his new rationalist type of interpretations of Islam, but what he did do was call on the Muslims to really benefit from both the European knowledge that was coming from Europe, as well as Islamic sciences, and that there should be the teaching of both in the college. And that was a very unique contribution of Sir Sayyid Ahmad. He was someone who was politically loyal also to the British, which was also something that was, you could say, it didn't always sit well with everyone, but there were others amongst the Muslims who weren't necessarily politically loyal right from the start. For example, the founding members of the Deoband school. The Deoband school was formed in North India, also in a town called Deoband. Their members were known, or at least the Deobandis themselves, they say that they fought in the mutiny on the side of the Muslims against the British, that they took an active role in trying to get rid of British rule as far as they could. There are accounts, for example, written by the biographer of Nanotwi, Manazir Ehsan Jilani, who talks about Nanotwi's valiant efforts in fighting during the mutiny, and also like his subtle ways of resisting British rule. He wouldn't wear clothing, for instance, that had buttons, because he felt that those were a British invention and they should not be used by the Muslims for that reason. So the Deobandis had a really strong anti-British stance early on. But as the mutiny, with the mutiny and the establishment of the fact that, okay, Muslims are no longer in power, they realized that they had to change their program of action, essentially. And so their focus then became a focus on teaching the sciences of the deen they established that madrasa in Deoband, the original Deoband madrasa. They established that. Gangohi, Nanotvi, and one of the first batch of students included Ashraf Ali Tanvi, who's one of the most well-known of the Deobandi scholars from the 1900s. They established this school, and their emphasis in that school was on the manqulat. Remember, we talked about the two divisions of Islamic sciences. Their focus was on the manqulat, the transmitted sciences, and they focus very much on hadith, in the same manner as as an inheritance from Shah Waliullah. They very much on hadith, but they were not open to borrowing from the other schools and looking at the hadith to come up with new rulings in the way Shah Waliullah was. So not necessarily in that way, but essentially their focus was on the manqulat. And they also, the main legacy of the Deobandis was to push the individual Muslim to really enact the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that each Muslim should become familiar with the practice of the Prophet, from even as quote unquote mundane things like eating with the right hand or keeping a long beard, but also just having a very clear idea of what are the obligations of the religion, and then to move away from practices within Indian Islam that were seen now to be no longer in line with the Sunnah of the Prophet. Things like the Milad or the Mawlid, or other such practices, venerating the graves of the awliya, going there and venerating them in particular manners. These were things that were called out by the Deobandi scholars, as it was also by Shah Muhammad Ismail and Sayyid Ahmad Barelwi in an earlier time, the grandson of Shah Waliullah. So their focus now becomes, so if the focus of the modernists and the Aligarh people who came through Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan was try and bring Islam into line with scientific and rational thought, the focus of the Deobandis was, we need to learn the deen, the sharia, and put the sunnah into practice. And that should be done at every level, not just the level of those who are going to go on to be holding the role of ulama in society. So for example, you have Ashraf Ali Tanvi. He developed a kind of graduation scheme. Like, he developed a 3-tiered graduation scheme for when he was teaching, when he first started teaching after he graduated from Deoband. And his 3 tiers, he had one track called the Darsiyat, religious studies, for those who were able to pursue both the manqulat and the ma'qulat. Another called the Diniyat, matters of religion, which was for those who weren't really inclined toward the ma'qulat, kind of like the logic philosophy stuff. They just wanted the straight matters of religion, and so it was focused more just on the manqulat. And then he had a very final, very condensed program titled the Daman al-Takmil fi Zaman al-Ta'jil, the guarantee of completion for rapid pace study. And this was for individuals who just didn't have the time to commit to formal education, right? This was the track for any regular Muslim who is able to make the time to study even a little bit. We need to have you study so that you know the deen, right? And you see in here the fear and the stress that if we don't find a way to communicate the deen to the regular person, the cultural and the political things that had been in place in the past no longer are there. We might lose these people. And so, you see again here their call to action being one, again, as a response to minoritization. And then finally, the teachings of Ahmad Riza Khan Barelwi, these were in different altogether from the first two. If we have a call to rationalist thought from the modernists, and we have a call to a very outward embodiment of the Sunnah in the Deobandis, what I would say is the thing that marks the work of the Barelwi, of Ahmad Reza Khan Barelwi and his school, is that one should have a very deep respect and veneration for what has been passed down to us from our predecessors, our religious predecessors. And like Sir Sayed, Barelwi was also politically loyal for pragmatic reasons. He felt that it was better to be under Christian rule because they were people of the book rather than Hindu rule. He was also worried that if it were to transfer to Hindu rule, the majoritarian rule would cause problems for the Muslims because they would just be beholden to the whim of the majority population. And so he was very loyal still to the British. But his his program of religious reform focused on people really needing to stick to the madhab, stick to the ritual practices also of the Sufis of India, so that we don't leave the milad, we don't leave things like, there were certain Qadri practices, such as veneration or commemoration of the birth of Abdul Qadir Jilani, that would happen in a certain way. It's called the Gyarwi. These certain rituals that were very entrenched within Indian Muslim practice. Maulana Ahmad Reza Khan, he emphasized these to such a degree that it was as if, if you were to leave what had been passed down from the legitimate sources of and the legitimate figures of the religion, that you were in fact committing a kind of treachery to the religion. And for this reason, it makes sense that he called his group the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, because he felt this was the Jama'ah. This was what had been agreed upon for centuries, and we need to stick to that practice and really make sure that we venerate the pious figures of the past in order to have that sense of submission and connection to what the Islamic legacy that had been there in Muslim India. Now, what we hear most seriously from the work of Maulana Ahmad Reza Khan is his very strong rebuttals of various groups. You'll find he was a very prolific writer, and he had many books. And you have rebuttals of the Qadianis, you have rebuttals of the Nadwatul Ulama. He didn't agree with their approach and their methodology. He wanted it to be more in line with the traditional modes of teaching the religion. He, unlike the Deobandis, he did not move away from the ma'qulat. He didn't de-emphasize those in the way that the Deobandis had. He very strongly emphasized that both the manqulat, the fiqh, tafsir, all that has to be taught along with logic and philosophy. All of them have to be taught. You can't have one without the other. And he was very proud of the fact that the legacy of Islam included a very well-rounded, in this way, sort of curriculum. And the thing, though, that some of you, if you've heard of the Deobandis and the Barelwis, you probably are aware of the fact that there was a strong sort of animosity, you could say, particularly from the side of the Barelwis towards the Deobandis. And in short, as we close, we're going to close in just a couple of minutes. What I would say is that if you look at the work of the Ahmad Reza Khan, the reason why he has a real problem with the Deobandis and figures like Maulana Shirali Tanwi or Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, why Maulana Ahmad Reza Khan has a problem with them, is that in their work, they are de-emphasizing or even saying it is impermissible sometimes, depending on who they're talking to. If they're talking to the common people, what you might call the awam, they would say it's not permissible for you to do a maulid. It's not permissible for you to go and visit the graves and do certain practices that used to happen at the graves. And they would de-emphasize these things for the regular Muslim. But in their writing for a more more educated class of Muslims, you'll find that in fact they didn't have a problem with the Mawlid in the way that you might understand or know from the like a Wahhabi criticism, for example, of the Mawlid is it's bid'ah. The Prophet ﷺ never did it, therefore it's haram. That kind of simplistic methodology is not what the Deobandis were doing. They would say this is something that is legitimate and it's fine within the sources of the deen. We see that there are precedents for adopting such rituals if there's a benefit for it, but there are too many things that happen at these, with these culturally embedded practices now that are simply inappropriate. There's a lot of mixing of the sexes, or seems to be some confusion about who is, if you're going to the grave and you're making a dua, they were worried that the regular Indian Muslim might actually believe that it was the saint who was answering their prayer, not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so they had this like nuanced way of saying it might have been okay before, but now because of our politically changed situation, it's no longer okay. And they basically said, it's a situational thing. It's because of the political and the cultural situation on the ground. The relevance of those practices is just not there anymore. And so they de-emphasized it. Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, his response was, how can you say that? These, the same people who you say you are inheriting your tradition from, the same ulama that we study from, and the same tariqas that we are a part of, you are a part of, and you venerate those same people, and you accept that they were true, and yet they, like, for example, Shah Waliullah himself used to participate in the Mawlid. Shah Abdul Aziz used to have a Mawlid, regular Mawlid. And how can you say it's haram or bid'ah to the masses when your own teachers used to do these things? And for him, that disrespect, that kind of disrespecting of the people you were inheriting from was so terrible that it amounted to takfir. It amounted to making these people who in his eyes were just claiming to be a part of that intellectual legacy, that they were in fact not a part of that legacy, and that they were violating an essential aspect of the deen, which is submission being important not just at a religious level where in your ibadah, but also at an intellectual, in the way that you think about things. If you're not submitting to the people who brought you the deen, then there's something really, really wrong with you. So this is, in sum, you could say the three reformist responses that come as a response to minoritization. The modernists wanting to correlate Islam with modern thought, the Deobandis emphasizing the individual enactment of the Sunnah and giving precedence to the Sunnah over culturally embedded religious practices that the Muslims had for centuries, and the Barelwis really emphasizing veneration and respect as a really important aspect of, or the important aspect of, how to preserve the deen now in the face of minoritization. And I think, inshallah, we'll just close with that, because I do want to leave a little bit of time if there is for questions. In summary, this is just something that I had in towards the end of the article that I had referenced, the thing that I have been taking from this for this presentation. The link that ties together these reformist groups among the Indian Muslims in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries was their active response to minoritization. They were all actively, in some way, responding to minoritization. It's clear, unlike in the first half of the article, I had talked a lot about, what happened with the Khilafat movement, what happened with Abul Kalam Azad. There were other figures that I talk about who had a political response to minoritization. It was still religiously embedded, but it was a political response. These three groups, it was not it doesn't seem that it was a political aspiration that drove their efforts as much as it was a desire to protect the dignity and the faith of their fellow Muslims and to really protect the iman of their fellow Muslims, including that of Sir Sayyid. As odd as some of the positions I mentioned to you guys today might sound, definitely if you read his work you find that there's a real sincere concern. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows sincerity on behalf of any of us, but there's a real concern to protect the Muslims from losing their, not just their cultural but their religious heritage. And now that they were without the apparatus that resulted from state sponsorship of local religious and spiritual figures, they didn't have any political establishment, they didn't have the empire to support their religious institutions. Now they had to find other ways of anchoring the belief and practice of Islam. And I think that the legacies that they have of the three responses that they have, they continue to inform the way Muslims, both in South Asia as well as in the vast South Asian Muslim diaspora, how they think about how to live as minority Muslims. So that's our quick summary for today. And I apologize if I've been sort of all over the place. I wanted to cover a lot, and there's a lot more in the paper itself. But I hope that inshallah I've conveyed a little bit of the what political rule meant for the Indian Muslims, what the loss of that meant for them, and the ways in which they boldly sort of tried to think of different ways of imagining their role as human beings on earth, in the way that Shah Waliullah did with his theory of irtifaqat, and then how various people in very different ways. I mean, if you look at the three groups, they're very different from each other. If you and I, if we are in any way familiar with these three groups from before, it'd be like they have nothing in common whatsoever, aside from maybe, okay, they were sort of Hanafi or something, but other than that, what's similar about them? But in fact, they were all responding to the same call. And I think it's really something that we should think about as a unifying factor in the response to minoritization. So thank you so much. And I hope, inshallah, that you've been able to benefit from our session today. If you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to field those.
Go ahead and put it in the comments below. I think one question, just to get the ball rolling, is what factors prompted Shah Waliullah to translate the Quran for the masses, and why wasn't the need for an idiomatic translation perceived before then?
Thank you, Allah. That was a really good question. Thank you so much. So, so there was actually some political instability that was present even in the time of Shah Waliullah. Even though that wasn't the British, there was some instability. There was there was invasions that were happening from various other parts of the subcontinent. You had the Hindu Marathas also. This was like a very strong nation empire within India that was trying to sack Delhi. Nadir Shah from Persia also. There were a number of different kinds of people who were sort of trying to get their hands on North India, and that political instability, I think, is what urged him to come up with his synthesis of the way he thought about the religious sciences, the way he thought about the hadith sciences, what he had taken from the Hijaz. He brought it home in a time of instability and tried to see how he could put that as a way to secure what was that threat. So that was what. And what was the second part of your question? Why he translated it into I'm not sure. I don't know if I can actually say what were the concrete factors that made him think of translating for the masses as, or translating for a greater subsection of the Muslims than people did of the past. Why did he come to that? Definitely, I do think that he was influenced by some of the people that he came into contact with in the Hijaz. There was a one of the scholars there, Al-Qurani, who he had studied with in particular, who had a certain kind of perspective on hadith and the way to study hadith that I think influenced the way Shah Waliullah thought about it.
I see. Jazakumullah khairan. I think there's another question online. If you are able to, can you kindly repeat the name of the fast-paced shorter curriculum and one reference to it?
Okay. Let me see. It was a Daman. 1 second. So the first was the Darsiyat. The second was the Diniyat, which was more focused just on the Manqulat. And then the third was the Daman al-Takmil fi Zaman al-Ta'jil. And this is something that you can see discussed in the biography of Ashraf Ali Thanwi called Ashraf al-Sawaneh. So if anyone's interested, you can write to me and I can give you a reference. I'm also, inshallah, in my forthcoming book, tentatively titled The Quest for Everlasting Kingdom. I also talk about this program in detail and why Maulana Thanvi had why did he come up with this type of a program. I hope that helps, inshallah. Ala?
نعم جزاكم الله خيرا. Yeah, so if there's any more questions online, I think, okay. It seems like there is no more questions, alhamdulillah. Again, jazakumullah khairan. This was very, very insightful. So I think, inshallah, we can conclude here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Jazakumullah khair.
Alhamdulillah, it was an honor. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.